turn the microphone on. Why? Okay. Okay, does this work? Okay, good. Where is the other? Okay, this is fine. We got according to the clock, we got another minute or so left before we start. Well, the stream is on. It starts at 5 till. And that's so that I can check it on my phone to make sure it's working with both sound and picture. Because sometimes it's picture no sound, sometimes it's sound no picture, sometimes it's neither because of user error. Yes. So
But even the best technocrats, they have trouble with this stuff. All these,
oh,
everybody gets trouble.
yeah. No. And the biggest one is the one for the church, and seems like nobody else has the no understanding about how to make the picture come back. Because if it loses power, we lose the picture. And so if it loses power on Monday, the picture is gone through. So the picture doesn't work on the next Sunday. But I can go and fix it. So I'm constantly getting texts, even when I'm at a conference. How do we fix this again? So anyway. All right. Adoration is here tomorrow, and that because we have First Penance at 6. tomorrow night. So in your charity, I ask you to pray for our young ones, the second graders, as they come in shaking. So, but it's so adorable. So, all right. Well, welcome. I wasn't in town last week. I was at a conference. So welcome to the second edition of Kerygma this semester. This is our sixth semester that we're starting of this. So it really does make a difference, and it really is a wonderful thing. And I applaud and I very much appreciate y'all coming. So, but tonight we're going to answer the question, the age-old question, does God exist? And that is perhaps one of the most important questions in all of history. And it's the most asked question, at least in our culture right now, when it comes to religion. Because throughout time, people thought of gods or God. The sun was a god because they couldn't understand how the sun rose and set. They couldn't understand the waters. They were afraid of them. So they had gods in the waters and all of the different things. But our God that we worship and is so personal to us is a much different entity than the rest of those gods. So I'm just mentioning that now. I'm not going to continue on with all the gods. We're going to just talk about our God, the God of Isaac and Abraham and Jacob and Moses and Elijah and Jesus and Paul and us. So, but the question that we hear most of the time is, well, isn't it a matter of opinion whether there's a God or not? We have this whole sense that we can say yes or no, that God exists or no, it doesn't. And so because it's my opinion. And this really is a problem in our culture because we've elevated opinion to the level of truth. So the question becomes, is it true because I believe it? Or do I believe it because it is true? We're in the latter category. But we all know people who come and say, well, this is just a matter of opinion, which God is the right one, or, something like, I like Buddha or Vishnu or all of those other religions around the world. But those aren't God, like a creator God, a personal loving God. In fact, Buddha is not even a God. Buddha is just a person who talked about enlightenment. I digress. Because we've been indoctrinated into this whole sense of my opinion must be the right one. Because it is my opinion. If I must be right. And the danger of this is that we're relegating whole classes of ideas to the garbage can of opinion, where ideas that are apparently neither true nor false, and which you can choose to believe or not. Our minds are deformed by this way of thinking, and we look at anything other than science or math as just mere opinion. Because, after all, math, 1 + 1 is 2 in every situation, everywhere. It's a constant around the world. And so that's why we have so much issue between science and religion, is because science has some tangible results. Religion maybe not the same tangible results, but I'll tell you what, up until the last half of the last century, it really wasn't even a question whether or not there was a God. But we run into people like Richard Dawkins, who is a biologist and who has, of course, been one of the poster children for atheism, that there is no God, that all of this, all of what we're doing here is done by random choice because everything just fell into place. I watched a thing on the universe. I was really excited for it too. It was a brand new series on the universe, and I'm big into science, and it was really looked like it was well done, and the graphics were spectacular, and the host was Morgan Freeman, who was God in, what was it, both in the movies. Anyway, I watched about the first 5 minutes of it, and I was so bitterly disappointed because at every moment in his spiel about how the universe came into being, he would say, and we were fortunate that, and it was lucky that this happened, and this just happened so perfectly for us, and yada, yada, yada. And he was never saying anything about a creator. And I was like, you had the opportunity here. Maybe it's not a personal God even that you're dealing with, but at least you can deal with the fact that the vast majority of people in the world that has ever been have believed in God. Because our God is, like I said, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and beyond, but also the Jewish God, as we know, and the Muslim God. The people who are Muslim or Buddhist or Jewish all believe in the same God. And so right now, that adds up to about 2.5 to 3 billion people around the world living. So it's most of who we are. So we want to believe this, but we can see that this happens, that reality does not conform itself to our thoughts. There are not separate realities between people. We're all sitting in this room. You're all sitting on these chairs, and I'm standing here talking. And that's a reality. That is not different for you or for myself or for anybody else or even the people who are streaming or whatever. It's not different. There's no one can have an opinion that this is different, that my thought about it sees it completely differently than anybody else's. The actual tangible results and the actual tangible things that are happening. Either we're in some mass delusion or it's real. Those are the only two possibilities. So when we know statements are true or false, like, for instance, murder is really mortally wrong, or it's not. God either exists or he does not. So we have all of those coming to the question of whether God exists. And the church also aids the knowledge of God's existence and says our existence, or God's existence, can be known without faith or divine revelation. People can come by reason to know that there's a God. And so even if someone in the middle of South America, in the jungles of South America, never met anyone who's Christian, never met anyone who is a faithful believer, they can know that there's a God by their own thought and by their own reason. So that's the thing. We should be able to know that God exists. Now, how is it possible to do that? Well, we do have proofs for the existence of God. If someone knows why they know something, they can defend their belief, then they can be said to know that thing, and that idea for them is knowledge. And the argument for God's existence begin with direct and common experience for philosophers throughout history, including some who were not at all religious. Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, all Greek philosophers several thousand years before Christ, have laid out and expounded on and defended these arguments. So, the First Vatican Council confirmed the statement that the existence of God can be proven by our reason alone. And this was in the document Dei Filius. God, the origin and end of all things, can be known with certainty by the natural light of human reason through the things that he has created. So, the church never has offered a full proof that God exists. It's the basis of the church. So, to prove, that it exists, that God exists, and the church exists, seems to be something that the church has never desired to take on. Why would they? It's like trying to prove that I exist or that you exist to somebody who doesn't believe it. It just doesn't seem to be something that we can really get into. Many of the philosophers throughout the church's life, including you go to Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, and he's a Franciscan, and he has a college up in New York named after him. Can't think of it, but my niece went there. Isn't that horrible that I can't think of the name of the college? I'll think of it sometime in the middle of when I'm saying something. So, and the philosophers may be quite persuasive, but there is really a lack of metaphysical certitude based on things like a mathematical proof. It presupposes some bit of knowledge or may leave room for doubt. The medieval understanding of God, which St. Thomas Aquinas lived, does not allow for doubting his existence. The proof that follows is a paraphrasing of Aquinas's, who is called the Angelic Doctor, many writings that dealt with this subject. It proves the existence of a being that is one, immutable, eternal, infinite, omniscient, and omnipotent. In fact, we can be more certain of God's existence than we can of our own or our sitting in this room. So let's start with all of this by taking a position of radical doubt. Suppose for a moment that you are not a human being with an actual body. In reality, you are nothing more than a brain floating in a vat of fluid, with electrodes attached to various parts of your exterior that allow, Dr. Frankensteins and evil scientists to manipulate you into thinking that what you perceive is actually here, when in fact it's nothing more than an imaginary world constructed by the scientists. right now, they are making you think that you're sitting right here, when in fact, you're not. Kind of an odd place to start, isn't it? But yet, this is, when we go through some of these arguments and we talk to people who are atheist and really dyed-in-the-wool atheists, some of their arguments seem to us to be completely ludicrous as well. They believe that our arguments are ludicrous, and we believe that theirs are as well, you know. Because, let's just face it, scientifically, the infinitesimal possibility that everything happened just so that we exist, and is, I mean, it's incredibly small. I mean, to think that we have, you know, throughout our lifetime, 40 trillion plus cells throughout our bodies that live and die and continue to form us, continue to make us different, continue to help us grow and learn and all of this. It just seems absurd to say that this all happened by chance. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So we start with the point of extreme skepticism, and we're going to work through and prove beyond all possible doubt that God exists. So we go to René Descartes, who said, cogito ergo sum, which is, I think, therefore I am. Or if you listen to Monty Python, I drink, therefore I am. But even if we're just a brain in a vat, our own existence can be verified by simply the fact that we perceive, that we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch things, and that we're even thinking. Whether or not our own perceptions are accurate is irrelevant to this question. But even if you doubt your own existence, you must exist, because it's impossible for a non-existent thing to doubt. In order to doubt, you have to exist. So we're saying that we exist because we are thinking. In fact, the very therefore denying our own existence is a contradiction in terms. Can't deny mine, and you can't deny yours. But there is at least one thing that exists. Because if we think, then at least one thing exists in this world. Because, after all, if nothing else is there, but we're all thinking, or one of us is thinking and dreaming all this up, there's at least one thing that exists. There has to be. It's impossible for us to be deceived in that. In fact, it's conceivable that each of our perceptions is a delusion. But even if that's the case, even if nothing that we think actually exists, we're still thinking. We still, or one still must exist. So we use the word entity in this. This is a long proof, by the way. So entity is the word that we have for anything that exists. So you exist or I exist, so we're an entity. So we can know with certainty that there is at least one entity, at least one thing of which the term existence can be used. If there were no such thing as existence, nothing would exist, not even you, but as we've seen already, that's impossible. Thomas Aquinas would say there must be an act of being in which all entities participate. This act of being must itself exist. It must be an entity. Thomas calls this entity esse, E-S-S-E, which is Latin for to be or to exist. So now that we've established by proof that esse is an entity, we must ask what is the nature of this entity and what is its definition? Because by its very existence, it has to have some form of definition and some form of nature. So to answer these questions, we must consider existence by itself, apart from everything else. For what do we mean when we say that something exists? We mean that it is actual. For example, an acorn is actually an acorn, and potentially an acorn tree. A tree is actually a tree and potentially lumber. Lumber is actually lumber and potentially a desk or a table. A desk is actually a desk and potentially firewood. Firewood is actually firewood and potentially ashes. So all things have at least one state of being that they are, and one state of being that they can become. All things have at least one. In other words, the thing is actually what it is right now. It's potentially what it might be in the future. So now, when we say that something exists, we normally refer to an actuality rather than a potentiality. For instance, if I held up an egg and I said, this egg exists, you'd know what I'm talking about because of what I'm saying is this egg is actual, or this is actually an egg. But if I held up the egg and said, this chicken exists, that doesn't make sense. Because, well, it's the potential of the egg. And do all eggs equal chickens? No, because some eggs equal breakfast. But, so the fact that the egg is actual and that the chicken is potential is a concept of existence that primarily applies to the egg's actual state and only secondarily to its potential state. Now, potentiality is still a form of existence because we have chickens who come from eggs. So the fact that the egg has the potential to become a chicken means that the chicken must exist and the state of existence must exist. Am I making sense here? Okay. I just don't want to be talking over everybody's head because I know this can be a little bit muddy and messy, but it's the foundation of the arguments of what we're going to be covering this year, this semester, and so we have to go through this kind of thing. So, but what we realize when we think about it is potentiality is inferior to actuality. In other words, potentiality is a shade of existence, the same way that pink is a shade of red. Just as we would say that pink lemonade is red, but not in the same way that Hawaiian punch is red. So we say that potentiality exists, but not as much as actuality does. Actuality is the fullness of existence. So going back to the brain in the vat hypothesis, we know that we are actual, even if nothing else we perceive exists. We know we must be by our very thought. So esse is nothing but pure actuality. Potentiality is what we would consider a privation of actuality. It's the lack or the potential, it's potentially something else, but it's takes away from actuality. Because if something is actual and it has the ability to become something else, therefore has a potential, it means that if we take away the actuality of one state and it becomes something else, like an egg becomes a chicken, it takes away that actuality of being an egg, because you can't be two things at once. So darkness is not a substance itself, but the absence or privation of light. So Easter Vigil, we all come into the church, it's dark, there's no lights on, and the one candle that walks into the church, basically carried by me here, shines throughout the church. And then it gets divided but undimmed and goes through all the people, and pretty soon the entire church is bathed in candlelight. It's one of the most amazing celebrations and ceremonies that we have. So, anyway. Now, a thing considered in itself contains nothing but its fullness. The nature of light consists of nothing but light itself. Light does not contain darkness. But darkness, as I said, was a privation of light. So the essence of the essay, thus the essence of essay is pure actuality, just as the essence of light is pure light. So St. Thomas argues that all entities participate in essay insofar as they are actual. Therefore, that in which they participate, essay, must be actual. In fact, it cannot admit of any potentiality. So, in order to fulfill its being, it must be actual, must be actually here. You know, this table must be an actual table. It's not going to be anything else. It's not going to worry about becoming firewood or being taken out to put into the new, what do they call that thing? That we're going to build here. The pavilion, thank you. So, essay does not only exist, but it must exist. Existence itself is pure actuality with no potentiality. This means that the essence of existence is nothing other than existence. So, existence is of itself. Existence is the fullness of itself. And from this it follows that essay itself must exist, for if it did not, it would violate its own essence, which is completely impossible. So if that table violated its own essence and was in fact something else, it would not be a table. It would exist as something else, whatever that may be. So, here we go. Essay is distinct from everything else that exists. We know that we exist, and we know that essay exists, but we also know that the two are not identical. For let's say we're a brain in a vat again, everything we perceive is an illusion. We can still recognize that. While we are actual in some ways, we are also potential in other ways. You actually perceive something that, or you actually perceive that you're sitting here listening to this talk, and you're potentially perceiving something else. You're actually existing right now. You potentially exist 5 minutes from now. So moreover, anything else that may exist has the same attribute. Its essence is composed of both actuality and potentiality. But, as we saw before, esse is nothing but pure actuality. Thus, it must be distinct from any other entity. So if there were more than one esse, then it would be distinctions among them. You know, if there were more than one esse, and they would be completely different. There would be, you know, you'd have this over here, x being an esse, this over here, y being an esse, but they cancel everything out because if esse is pure existence, pure actuality, there can't be more than one, just by its very nature. Does that make sense? I know this is pretty hard philosophy. So, but if there were more than one esse, then there would be distinctions among them, but distinctions imply limitations, and limitations imply potentiality. But since esse is pure actuality, it has no limitations, which means there is no distinction in esse. Therefore, it is only one esse. And change involves potentiality. In order for something to change, it must have the potential to change. We can't change into something that we don't have the potential to change into. It must have a potentiality that is to be actualized. But since esse is purely actual, it has no potential to change. Therefore, esse is not only one, it's immutable and unchangeable and unchanging. And because of that, esse must also be eternal. Time is nothing but the passing of the future into the present, into the past. It's the changing of the not yet into the now, into the no longer. It's basically a measurement of light in some respects, because light, as it moves, needs to create, and for us to know that we are moving from light to dark, and back and forth. That probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So it must be, esse must be outside the realm of time, which means that there is no future, present, or past with esse. In other words, esse is non-temporal or eternal. You get where we're going with this? So esse must also be infinite, because space is nothing but the changing of over here to over there. Even in the midst of the universe, we can say that we just found a nebula 30,000 light years away. And so it's over there as opposed to over here. So anything that is actually here is potentially there. There's a potential that we could get in a rocket ship and fly that far. It'd take us much longer than our lives, but it's still potential. But because esse is immutable, it must be outside the realm of space. It has no spatial constraints. That is, esse is infinite. Esse must be omniscient. Even if you're a brain in a vat, you can perceive that you have the capacity to know. But because you are only partially actual, and esse is purely actual, esse must know all that there is to know. That is, esse is all-knowing or omniscient. and SA must be omnipotent. We can perceive that we have the capacity to do some things that are logically possible. Since we are only partly actual, and SA is purely actual, SA must be able to do all things that are logically possible. That is, SA is all-powerful or omnipotent. We have thus proven the existence of SA, that not only exists, but must exist, and is one, unchanging, eternal, infinite, omniscient, and omnipotent. That's God. I mean, that right there defines who God is. And there are much easier ways, and perhaps shorter ways, to speak that God does exist. That even if all of our sense perceptions are false, even if we believe that we are nothing but a brain in a vat being manipulated by scientists into believing that we are sitting here right now, when in fact we're not, then the two things we can know with absolute 100% certainty is that you exist and God exists. Any questions about that? I mean, this is, like I said, this is some very difficult philosophy, but it's logically, see, that's Thomas Aquinas. If you ever read Aquinas, in the Summa Theologica, which is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of questions, it starts out with, this is the question. This is what is commonly thought. So this becomes the problem with this question, and here's my answer. And it's difficult because it's philosophical, and he uses a lot of concepts that we don't necessarily use every day. But it's one of those where we come to understand and see his logic and see how he's proving God exists and all kinds of other things. So, what would we say if someone came up to us and said that God does not exist? Are you going to go through SA and actuality and potentiality and all of that and confuse them just like I'm confusing you and lose them all over the place? And so there is, that's right. You send them to me and I'll talk about, I'll put them to sleep. There we go. There are any number of other ways to prove that God exists. The first is that we look at science. Science is the study of trying to figure out how things work. But science is asking the question, how? Religion is asking the question, why? And in some sense, how as well, because you have to realize that the church and science are not separate. I mean, there's a Vatican Observatory. There have been hundreds of scientists and priests who have doctorate degrees in so many scientific things and who have furthered science. Now, has it always been in step with correct science? Perhaps not. We look at Galileo and all of this, that people give me that argument all the time. And I'm like, well, that was the problem with the Pope, who didn't understand the concept of what he was talking about, because throughout the entire history of the church and half the history of the Jewish tradition before the church, they believed that earth was round and that it was set in motion by God, and the earth was not the center of everything. So for a couple of thousand years before Galileo, scientists who were theologians and philosophers talked about the earth in a scientific concept and prospect, and where it is in the universe and how it was created. Now, we get into the problem of creationism versus the scientific theory method, but the Big Bang Theory was brought forward by a priest, Lemonnier, from France in the 1920s. And in fact, there are many pictures of him and Einstein working together on all kinds of different things. So to say that the church and science don't agree, well, perhaps they don't agree on certain things, but it doesn't mean the church is anti-science. And it doesn't mean that science is the only authority. Because through the specific philosophical proof, we proved the existence of God. And it's as unchangeable as the proofs that we used to do in geometry. You remember the proofs in geometry that we all did in high school? Where, you had if, then, if and only if, and all those different aspects of, geometry. So we get into this a little bit more, and we start to think about, all right, how do we deal with people who basically are completely atheist and don't believe God exists? And because, you'll have a lot more chance of somebody coming up to you in the grocery store and saying, "Oh, I don't think God exists," than talking about essay and potentiality and actuality. In fact, I would guarantee that no one in the grocery store would come up and say that to you. I've had people come up and say to me when I'm in my collar in the grocery store or in Mark's, stuff like, "Oh, I'm sorry that you're a priest because you're wasting your life." It's like, excuse me? Well, God doesn't exist, so you must be wasting your life. You're doing this to convince people, and you're doing this to snow people and, take people out of what is real. It's like, you think so, huh? Okay, let's go essay and but you may not be able to convince anyone because of that whole thing we talked about at the very beginning of our own opinion as being right, and the horrible situation in our world that we have because of that. Because if each one of us thinks that we're right about everything, how do we discuss anything? How do we debate things? Because if you go to a debate, the first thing they're going to do is identify their terms. Because if you don't define the terms, you can say the same exact thing and mean two different things. Because our opinion is in those terms. So, if somebody came up and says, "I don't know what makes Catholics think God exists," a rational person would ask for proof of the existence of something he could not see. It's like living in a fairyland to believe that there's a personal God who exists somewhere out there. Well, the answer to that, at least the first, is that your challenge applies, of course, to to Protestant Christians, Catholic Christians, observant Jews, devout Muslims, Orthodox, and all kinds of others. In fact, I dare say that the vast majority of the human race for most of its history has believed in some form of God. Are you implying that the vast majority of human race has been irrational? Well, I don't want to be judgmental, right? So I'll refrain from answering that question, right, because you can't. I don't see any good reason for believing in a God like Christians do. I want you to prove to me that God exists. Because that's what they're actually saying. If they say, I don't think God exists, they're saying, I dare you to prove to me, because I am the arbiter of all truth, and I want to know that God exists. And you can't convince me because my opinion says he doesn't. So we go back to God either exists or he doesn't. Both cannot be true. And if we show the statement that God does exist, or God does not exist, leads to an absurdity, it only leaves that God does exist as the only rational statement that we can have. So we must distinguish between the different types of absurdity in the different disciplines. In mathematics, absurdity means a contradiction. Saying that 3 is not greater than 2 leads to a contradiction with other well-known truths of mathematics and therefore is absurd. You can't say that 2 is greater than 3. Right? You can't say that 1 plus 1 equals 7.5. That's absurd. But in speaking of God, absurdity would mean something like this. If we deny that God exists, then we expect the universe and human life to look one sort of way. If we affirm that God does exist, then we would expect quite a different set of observations. The claim that is denying God's existence leads to absurd conclusions about the universe and human life. Let's just say, in a scientific world, as we were going back with the beginning of, when we talked about the universe and all of that, and the infinitesimal chance of us and what's going on all around us. There's so much diversity in that. Science wouldn't necessarily make that, because that makes it completely another layer of impossible, really, infinitesimal, because you add number of different multiplications of 10 and the negative multiplications of 10. Because the chance, I think somebody figured it out one time, it's 10 to the minus googolplex, which is a number with 100 zeros, and multiplied by another 10 to the minus googolplex. So you're talking about a number that is so small that we can't even fathom it. And if you start talking about all the diversity and all the differences of everything, and all the things everyone is able to do and everything has in common, the fact that we're diverse is not necessarily the proof of it, but the fact that we have all these things in common, that all of us bleed in the same way, all of us have the same color blood and the same this and the same that, it adds so much more complexity to it. That we're different from each other, and yet we have the same characteristics in a lot of ways. So it adds much more complexity. So the complaint would come back, do you mean to tell me that you can show me that my not believing in God is absurd? It seems to me quite the other way around. People believing in God seems to be living in a dream world, not in the real world. Well, we can sometimes understand why we say that, because we often thank God for the good and wonder why the bad happens. So the thanking God for the good things that happen, or conversely, we can say that we did the good, but the bad happened, and we want to blame somebody else. So, if we deny God's existence, it's incompatible with some of the more specific realities of the universe and of human life. And at least affirming God's existence is more rational than denying it. So the universe that we see every day and learn in various sciences, there's laws. There are ways that things happen. You know, like the fact that you can take the way the water, that hydrogen, two hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom come together and make water. That's a law. That has to happen. It can't happen any other way. You can't take two hydrogen atoms and two oxygen atoms and have water. You have hydrogen peroxide. And can you drink it? Probably, but I wouldn't recommend it. So the laws of nature are finite, and they can't change. We can't change the laws of nature. We can't make water out of anything else. So there is that thing. The universe displays effects that are governed by laws in nature. And same thing with the law of gravity, you know. Gravity works the same way everywhere in every situation. Now, there are some times when other forces make gravity different, but that doesn't change that gravity exists and in the way it exists. You know, it's like it's light. Light works the same way in every situation. Can you bend light traveling through space? Yeah, with gravity or some other force that is acted upon it. But it's still light, and it's still the same. It's not changing into something else. It's being affected by another aspect. So, well, we talk about Richard Dawkins, and I'm not really that competent to judge whether or not he has been successful in proving there's not a God. But many of the biologists that I know, and I know quite a few because I was in the chem department and we hung out with the biology department occasionally, and they have grave doubts about his methods, procedures, and his attempts. But that's not essentially important, because the point that I would like to make about this is much more foundational. Even if we can show a linkage between the chance occurrences of organic history and the laws of genetics, for example, it does not follow that such laws came from those chance occurrences. At best, all it shows that those chance occurrences are not compatible with the law of genetics. Like, we have a double helix with 23 pairs of chromosomes as a part of our DNA. Everyone does. In fact, even Jesus, as they tested the Eucharist, had 2 pair of chromosomes in the blood that was on, that was miraculously there. They've tested this on any number of miracles throughout the centuries. And Jesus's DNA, and I don't know how they figured the one out, is exactly consistent with Mary's. It's the only example in the entire history of humanity where mother and son share the same exact genes. Yeah. That's what I don't know. But it's, I mean, I think, I don't think it's actually a sample from Mary that they're looking at, but they are looking at the differences between male genes and female genes are slightly different. So Jesus somehow has the female genes that Mary would have. This is, I read that article decades ago, so I couldn't tell you exactly how they tested it or what the thought was, but you know, I would have to look that up. I didn't think about it until I'm standing up here talking right now. So
they didn't actually have a sample of Jesus' blood, or
well,
and they could do DNA.
What happened was that there were miraculous occurrences, like the blood that liquefies every year on the same day, and actually last year liquefied 3 times.
Yeah.
But so they would test a small portion of stuff from that, and from the different miracles that happened around the world. The other part of this was the DNA from all the miracles that happened all the way around the world where they went and tested were all the same.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
It really is.
Well, it's miraculous. I mean, there's no, you know, yes, it's amazing, but miraculous is the only word I can think of that really defines it. How that would be anywhere near possible if Jesus weren't divine, I would have no idea. You know, how would any of us leave a sample of blood that would dry up and then become liquid again, and then dry up again, and every time it was tested, it came up with the same DNA, and it happened at different places all over the world, and all it came up with is the same DNA. That's God using ordinary things in extraordinary ways, which is the textbook definition of a miracle. So you could use that as a proof of God if you wanted. A lot easier than the actuality and potentiality and all that stuff. So what seems to be more rational? To believe in fixed laws of nature resulting from chance occurrences in the universe? That is, that in law-like patterns of nature emerging from unlaw-like events. That these laws come from a being who placed these laws in the very fabric of the universe. Okay, so there's a scientific principle called entropy. Have we heard of entropy? Yeah. It's the movement from order to disorder. And it is an immutable law of the universe. So the fact that we could look at the chance, it would seem highly impossible that because of entropy, things would become more law-like, more structured, more focused. It just wouldn't happen over centuries and centuries. It's absurd. So we can, when we talk about all kinds of examples, by the way, if you have a question, just let me know. In physics, we explain particular events by appealing to the general laws of nature. For instance, the phenomena of free fall. like Isaac Newton and the apple. Projectile motion, throwing of a baseball or shooting of a bullet, and planetary movement are all under the law of universal gravitation, because the law is more general and powerful than particular events. So even if things change, even if things affect them, they're still governed by that law. So appealing to chance just completely violates that principle too, because the cause must be more powerful than the effect being explained. So when we talk about appealing to chance to explain the laws of nature, is more absurd relative to God invoking God to explain the same laws. So if we invoke God to say how things work, the fact that it's a general, legal concept of the universe, that we have motion, that we have gravity, that we have movement, planetary movement. And they're all subject to gravitational forces. To come to a chance with that, where everything has to happen so perfectly, it's absurd. So, physical laws like gravity can be predicted. We can predict physical laws. Even though black holes cannot be necessarily verified, although we have had recent evidence of the site, or what we believe is a black hole, by some of the new telescopes, the James Webb and such. They're not supernatural constructs. God is not like gravity or a black hole. God's a supernatural entity, not a physical one. So we cannot have the whole, we cannot have the whole definition of being an observable being. We can observe the effects of God, but we cannot observe God. But we can go to the proofs. We can go to the mathematical constants. We can go to the gravitational constants. We can go to any of those things. And we can say, to have that develop by chance is not possible. It's completely absurd. So, what do you think? Did we prove that God exists? Oh, well, I understand, but there's also, the whole reason why we have this semester is so that we can defend our faith against attacks from others. And, yeah, and because logic is one of those immutable laws of nature, that things must happen logically, and to have them happen illogically means that something else happened that knocked them out of that logical sphere. We go forth with that. And we answer that way with proving the logic of God existing. And notice, nothing that I said today had anything to do with faith in God. What's that? I went for the proof of God by reason. Yeah. And the church teaches that faith and reason go hand in hand. And we need both. But the fact that we can prove that there is a God by reason says a whole lot about our faith. Because it comes to our faith and says, we can prove God without having that faith so that we can convince others who don't have that faith to believe that God is personal, to believe that God is with us, to see the miracles that happen every single day using natural things in a supernatural way. Speaking of that, did you know that they, a few years ago, found that the bottom of the Red Sea is in such a fashion that if you blow wind against it at a certain speed for a certain amount of time, it will part. They actually did a physical proof of that, a physical model of that. And then they all, and it was within a year or two of that, they found evidence of the Roman chariots, or the Egyptian chariots, on the bottom of the Red Sea. So, what's that? Yeah, I mean, I was reading these things, and people are like, well, some of my companions and colleagues ask me why I read scientific articles all the time. Well, number one, I grew up as a scientist. But number two, because these type of miracles happen all the time. And to see them through a scientific lens is incredible, because then you can see them both scientifically and in faith. And it means such a great deal to us to have faith and reason agree and point to the God that loves us. Any questions?
I think your comments about that DNA really fascinate. It's triggered my interest to explore that further, because that, you used the right word, miraculous.
Mm-hmm.
That's really striking.
Yeah.
I never heard that before.
Yeah. Well, one of the other reasons I read scientific journals.
I think it was last week that Father Matt mentioned something that was kind of interesting too, and he was talking about dominoes, and you know, you have dominoes in a row, and they're, how do they go down? Somebody pushes one, and then they all go falling.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he was talking about that and the idea of the start of everything, all the planets and the universe and everything that we have here in the world, and galaxies and everywhere else. He was saying, well, you know, where did this all, I mean, here we are human beings, and before that there was, you know, all these other things, maybe evolution, but so how did this all start? There must have been someone that did the push.
Yeah.
And that would be,
The unmoved mover, or the uncaused cause. You know, we proved that through the essay and the actuality and potentiality argument. That was the goal of proving that there has to be an unmoved mover and an uncaused cause. And basically, out of nothing, ex nihilo is the way they would describe it in the church. And out of nothing came all of this. That's the theory of the Big Bang. And even if you subscribe to the theory that it's not only a Big Bang, but it's a big crunch, and then Big Bang again, and going back and forth throughout the billions and billions and billions of years, something had to start it in motion, because it did not exist at one point. Yeah.
Next week, are we going to get into, a lot of people tell me, oh yeah, I believe in a higher power, but I don't believe in religion. I don't believe in religion. I'm spiritual.
Oh yeah. Well, spiritual.
Or I believe in a religion, but I have a higher power.
Yeah. Spiritualism without religion is kind of just, I can take my opinion and make it God. So that's when you get into spiritual but not religious, you get that. But Well, that'll be part of this. I mean, it's part of the semester. I don't know exactly, I don't have the thing in front of me of what's next week. You have it? Okay. Oh. Oh, next week is Why Should I Be Catholic? Which is basically, it's a sense of religious and, all that, so.
They say, okay, so what's the real religion? There's Lutheran, there's this or that, and Buddha and all this, so I'd rather believe in a higher power.
Yeah, right.
I can go out in the forest and pray.
Well, sure. I mean, we'll go, I'll definitely go through that. I think I have next week, so we'll definitely go through that as a part of Why Be Catholic, when you could be anything else. Well, if you were at 10:45 this last week, it was at one of the daily masses. I told the story of a priest who didn't have the morning masses, so instead of going over to the church, he decided he was going to get out and play a round of golf. And he knew he shouldn't, and he knew that if his parishioners knew that he did that, they'd be upset and everything like that. So he goes out and plays golf, and he is having the best round of his life. And on one of the back 9, he puts in a hole-in-one. First one of his life. And he's just so excited. And then he's just crestfallen because he can't tell anybody. So, anything else? All right. Well, thank you, and I will see you next time.